We are now live with the August 1st, 2018 modules team meeting. We have a packed agenda today. Before we get started, is there anyone who can volunteer to help with note taking today? Anyone?
Okay.
Thank you. First item of business that we have on the agenda today is to add Sendil Kumar as an observer, issue number 159. To take an look at 159, we've got a couple members of the team who are not on the call, and I believe that between those members who have agreed and the number of people that we have on the call, we have quorum. Is everyone in favor of this? Great. So I will go ahead and move forward on adding Sendil as an official observer, if that can be added as an action item for me. Move right into update on progress. The first thing we have on here is a presentation about loaders. Brad, is there any progress on that? Is that something we can add to a future agenda?
Already did this, so I don't know if it was just not removed from the agenda.
Okay, cool. We just need to remove the modules agenda from it. Great. Next up on the agenda, we have create terminology.md. Salah, that's a pull request that you have open right now. Can you give us a quick update on where it is and what you need people to do?
Yeah, so last week we were at a point where it was just Google Docs. So I went ahead, or actually last meeting, I went ahead and tried different formats. The format that we're probably going to go with is Markdown. In the actual initial issue, there are links for the other versions if anybody's interested in trying different formats. Anyways, but moving forward, I think it's good. We have the pull request. We're sticking with Markdown, and I see that there has been some interaction on the pull request. Moving forward, I think this is a document that belongs to everyone. It really helps that people who look at it and say, no, I don't like that definition, or they say, wait, that needs to be in the terminology, and they go ahead and just contribute to the document, and then we can all go through, a process of it, approvals or whatever based on the norm that these, processes take, I guess. Yeah, from there, I'll leave it up to the team, whatever you guys want me to do. I can go ahead and do that.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. We can kick that back to the pull request. People who are listening, if you could take the time to review that, and we can come back next week to dig in a bit more. The next thing we have on here is a developer survey. That was my pull request, I believe. I have not had time to dig into this at all. Is there anyone who's on the call right now who would like to take over driving a developer survey? It's not something that I have the bandwidth to do at the moment. I will take.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I can take that silence as a message to kick it back to that thread, and maybe we can just discuss it in the thread itself.
Agreed, actually.
Okay, cool. So now on to the meat of things. We're into our main discussion. I believe, is Jeff on the call? Jeff, you were saying that two of these items need to be merged. Was it 156?
Hey, yeah, the parse goals and experimental modules and ESM and JS are connected. So I was just suggesting we talk about them together rather than as separate things.
Okay, and what would you make a good title for that? Just
ESM and JS files.
Okay.
So I can introduce it. So basically, there were some issues opened with essentially like use cases where, like, long story short, that there needs to be the ability to for Node to parse a .js file with the ESM parse goal. And I don't know if it's really worth getting into what those reasons are, but there's long thread about like what those use cases are and how other solutions, don't work, et cetera. But we seem to have come to a consensus that Node needs to support this somehow. That doesn't mean that we need to change anything in experimental modules. It's like, not that this doesn't mean that we need to like get rid of .mjs, but just that we need an additional way other than the file extension to signal to Node that, hey, treat this file as ESM. And so then that led to the other issue 160, which was like, well, okay, here are some specific proposals for how to achieve this. What do people think of them? Can we come up with a design for an implementation that we can all agree with, and then maybe someone can go and implement it as a PR along the lines of that mode ESM PR that's already been opened against core from a while back. So yeah, that's kind of where we left off on all this.
Okay, so the floor is open right now if anyone wants to speak or if anyone wants to raise their hand.
There's raise hand.
Okay, Jordan?
Yeah, I think I agree with Jeffrey's phrasing that like this is something we need to enable. I want to make sure that we don't pigeonhole this as just being about CJS and ESM, because we also are going to have to handle binary modules and WASM and whatever future module types come in. So as long as we're thinking about this as a generic way to override the default parse goal for a file, then I think that sounds like a great idea.
Okay, Brad?
So I really like this because it's a cooperative kind of effort where we're trying to figure out what use cases can be served by kind of different methods, different features, whatever we want to call it. In particular, I would like to see more of this in the group. So I just really love the idea of not really fighting each other, because we sometimes fall into that pit. But I just want to be sure that whatever we design, we have this, is it a PR number 160? Whatever we design, we need to be very well thought out in what it means for usability, what it means for composition, and ensure that if we enable a feature, we aren't stepping on other features in a way of conflict. So I highly encourage people to kind of take a look at it. I think sometimes people get caught up on things, either file extensions or the word MIME. I would just encourage people to look at the use cases more than the actual, specific encoding of information. But I really like the direction this is going as a cooperative thing. So that's it.
Excellent, great. Anyone else? For right now, we've still got about 10 minutes on the clock, although we can move on to the next issues.
Michael's raising his hand.
Oh, Michael, yes. You are muted right now. I've unmuted you.
Okay, I tried to do it at the same time. The only thing I wanted to add is there any chance that some of the existing use cases that we've already put together can form the basis? As Bradley was just mentioning, starting to try to drive it off use cases, can we pull some subset from what we have as a starting point?
I'm not sure what that means. Can you rephrase base it off the use cases?
I guess it's that we already wrote up a bunch of use cases that were attempting to cover the different ways we'd want to use modules. And I'm wondering if a subset of those could be the cases that we want to, validate through do those, instead of having to come up with new use cases or new patterns, do we already have what we need in terms of those use cases to say, these are the cases we need to validate are covered by, you know, what's being suggested to be added to the package.json, whether it's MIME or whatever else.
I think I can try to tackle that unless someone else wants to. So the specific, like the way this came up in the first place was about build tools using the experimental modules implementation. And so like kind of the need is specific to that implementation. Like in experimental modules, I can't do X, kind of is like what the kind of where this started. And so it was like, well, what would we have to do to experimental modules to enable this use case? So in that sense, it's very particular to that implementation. Whereas like our general use cases that led to the features are kind of, I mean, at least I think, are written in a like agnostic way that like, I don't know what implementation is going to satisfy this use case. This is just something I want Node to be able to do kind of thing. Other implementations don't have this issue. Like the NPM implementation, for example, doesn't depend on file extensions. So there's no need to provide a file extension mapping, you know? So it's, yeah, this is kind of very specific to experimental modules. I don't know what this means about where we're going in general in terms of like continuing to develop that implementation as opposed to people proposing alternatives. Like my view on it was just that like, we might as well do all of the above. Like, let's keep improving experimental modules at the same time as people create others. And, you know.
Yeah, no, I think, yeah. And I was just hoping that if we've got sort of like features and use cases already, say, for example, you know, not saying this is the way to go, but eventually if we decided, oh, well, wait a sec, we'll just evolve the experimental modules implementation as a solution, we'd need to show that it actually satisfies those use cases. And if there aren't some that already require what we're talking about now, maybe we've got a gap. And if there are...
I should probably rewrite the original use case to be generic, as in like, I need a Node implementation that lets me do blank. So yeah, that's certainly valid. I can go back and do that.
Okay, that's the only thing I wanted to bring up. Thanks.
Brad, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just kind of want to reinforce that we have a bunch of different ideas going around about implementations. And those can vary wildly. They have different strengths. They have different weaknesses. I don't think any implementation on its own kind of is flawless. I think everything has trade-offs, and that's part of why this working group has so much to discuss. But I think this has been mentioned in a few places. It would be nice to have some base implementation that everybody could agree on. Some people dislike experimental modules. And so maybe we could base it off something more stripped down than that. I know Miles had a PR that also had controversy. So maybe making this kernel, this virtually unusable base implementation would be a good effort. And then we can build the usability on to it. So I'll give it back to you, Michael.
I was just going to add to that thought is a stripped down version of what we already have a possibility for that base, or does it have to start from scratch? Because just thinking of how do you get there most easily.
I can. Gil, you had your hand up. I'm sorry. Please speak. I'd like to speak after Gil.
I'd love to speak, but I'd like to hear the answer to Michael's question before I
Okay, yeah. Michael, I think it's very much a subset of what we have right now. Brad and I talked a little bit about what it could be, and perhaps we should spin up an issue particularly around that. The idea of making a subset kernel that could work would be removing any of the capabilities of the current implementation that stop future implementations from working. So things that we could remove, for example, would be supporting JS at all. And that doesn't mean that we will not support JS later, but it just means with having the no transparent interop and with removing the support for .js, that is now available to be decided upon in a future enhancement. Another example of this would be in making a more restrictive loader. I have a pull request already open for that. I'm not 100% if that's the implementation that we'd want to use, but by restricting the resolution algorithm of the loader itself, we would similarly be able to have the loader expand later. Another example of a restriction that we could introduce would be not having any sort of interop right away, but introducing the API that Gus was working on for make require. So we would have all of the kind of low-level capabilities that we would need to build the other APIs. It's not by any means a version of the module system that people are going to want to use, which actually may stop people from using them in production with these APIs incomplete, but it would be a kernel that any code that is written against would continue in theory to be supported by whatever we do later, because these would be kind of the core consistent API surfaces that would not change. It seems that I have incited a bunch of hands.
Okay.
Gil, because I don't think you were speaking directly to the points that I raised.
No, I'm good. I think it's a really, really good idea. It's not starting from scratch. It's starting from ES modules and figuring out how to build up to whatever generates a consensus. And instead of figuring out what is the end goal, let's start from small and build consensus slowly. And we can create an issue and start the conversation from there. It might start to becoming really constructive. I think it's a great idea.
Excellent. Thank you. Salah?
Yeah, so I think I have 2 points on this. First off is I always considered what would happen if we started off with ESM and implemented a CJS loader inside of ESM. I considered this because I was experimenting and because there wasn't much bandwidth for interop early on when experimental modules came out. It is definitely not going to be, transparent interop perfectly, but I've seen that required is actually more accessible from ES modules, and the interop level has increased. But again, everything is built, CJS loads an ESM ecosystem, and then that ecosystem can access Node through the CJS wrapped ESM interface. The second point is if we start off, with a minimal implementation, I think that if you take away the gains that happened over the past year from experimental modules like the new additions, it was very restrictive early on. If we're going to compare it to about 6 months ago, things were just very difficult. So I think we have to be careful which features are actually just the evolution of the language itself, and which features are definitely going to create like bottlenecks that will make it more useless to have a minimal implementation out in the ecosystem. Because if people get frustrated with a minimal implementation, they are likely not going to depend on it. They're just going to say that, okay, it was an expectation that didn't materialize. So we have to be careful what we can consider, something we can give up on.
Thank you, Salah. Just a quick question to everyone, really quickly. I am feeling a really, really great traction and movement towards consensus, the likes which we have not seen yet. It excites me. We have 2 more things on our agenda right now: features, adjustments, and groupings, and transparent or not interop. are people open to the idea of tabling these for right now and focusing the rest of our session specifically on discussing what a minimal implementation might look like? Does anyone, do I have any objections to that?
Yeah, I kind of object.
Yeah, if we don't agree on, I don't know, my take is if we don't agree on what a minimal implementation is, then we can't really talk about what the defaults should be. But
Awesome.
Someone just said they're not okay with it. So if they want to elaborate.
Did someone say they're not okay with it?
Yes.
What do you, not
so,
okay?
I mean, I already had my hand up. I don't know what order the hand was in. If you want to put me later than someone else, that's fine.
So Jeremiah, just to be explicit, I'm saying, should we table the discussion about this and continue with our agenda, or should we continue discussing this specific matter?
I think we should continue with our agenda. Because
Okay.
I don't really concede to what was talked about. I have some disagreement.
Okay, that's fair. So let's do this if people are open to it. We have features and adjustments for groupings set for 10 minutes right now and transparent or not transparent interrupt for 15. If we move those both to 10 minutes, we can add another, let's call it 5 minutes to go through the remaining hands that are up for this discussion. Is that cool? I hear no objections, so I'm going to move forward with Wes's comment. And let's just spend 5 more minutes on specifically, we'll add a new agenda item for a minimal kernel. I'm starting the timer now, and then we'll get back to our agenda in 5 minutes.
Sure. So Daniel here. I think at the surface level, it sounds like starting with a minimal implementation sounds good. My issue with that is that as you start adding more and more and more publicly, then you kind of may end up discouraging other efforts to solve other use cases. So for example, if you start off with certain file extensions, as the target, and then you solve all the other use cases, but then JS is never solved, then you basically kind of given license to say, this is the way that code should be written, but you haven't solved one of the use cases, and you've encouraged the community to kind of standardize around something that basically alienates the group of people who wanted to have that use case solved.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. I got most of that down. If you want to, I believe you were the one taking notes. If you want to finish off that sentence.
Sure, I can do that.
Great. Jordan?
So I think in general, the principle of let's build a minimal kernel and let userland and time evolve what can be built on that is a great philosophy. But I think that in this case, this is something that impacts the ecosystem. I feel very strongly that we only get one shot at this. Whatever we first ship unflagged, that is going to be the thing people depend on and people assume is the way it's going to work, and they're going to write their code based on that. And so I don't think a minimal kernel is sufficient to ship any module implementation. I see your note that you weren't imagining it was unflagged. That's great. But I don't care what we ship flagged until we agree on what's going to be unflagged. So the things that we've shipped now that are flagged, if we all agree that those don't matter, then cool, we'll just delete them. But the main, I think it's super critical that the first unflagged thing we have is not minimal, that it actually meets all the use cases that we want to meet initially, and also allows for the use cases we want to allow for. And I think that the longer we spend until we've decided that direction, the greater risk we have of letting the flagged implementation gain a lot of usage. So this happened with generators in Node 0.11. Big userland libraries started depending on them, because they were flagged for so long. So I think that even though I've cautioned against rushing to a shipping implementation, we do need to be careful that we don't ship a flagged implementation for too long that will end up tying our hands with what we can ship unflagged later. That's my piece.
Thank you very much. Jeremiah?
Yeah, I agree with what was it Wes and Jordan said. So I think doing a minimal implementation from here is a bad idea and step backwards. That's essentially what we had originally. As someone else said, a lot of things have been added onto it and adjusted it, as we've already seen use cases where stuff doesn't work very well and that sort of thing. Also, like I'm not really sure how minimal we can realistically get for something that's this complex. The entire module system and the interactions between maybe two module systems and stuff is very complicated. API surface and the interactions and whatever. And I don't think there's a way to make that like that minimal and pure and still be able to support people. And the other thing is, I personally consider some form of interop to be a requirement.
Thank you. Brad?
So this is a different direction than I thought this was going to go, actually. So this is kind of a meta comment or discussion. My thought was, at least personally, whatever this minimal kernel is, we never ship it anywhere. It is just the basis for all other proposals. I don't know how other people feel about that. Like we wouldn't ship it flagged, we wouldn't ship it unflagged. It's just all proposals must meet this baseline expectation. Then at least we've agreed upon something that all proposals can work with.
Okay, great. I think, Brad, that brings it to a place where we could reach consensus on it. We've got two more hands up. Let's get those two in, and then we'll move back to the agenda. Gil?
Yeah, I'll go with Brad. I would go even further. I'm not sure we even need to implement it. I think if we start with the minimal kernel and understand which can be consensual, and then work from that. So work positively until we reach consensus, instead of thinking how do we change the current thing, as a basis for discussion, not so much as a basis for implementation.
Excellent. Jeremiah?
Yeah, I mean, I'm okay with what the last two people have said, so long as, if that's really necessary, that seems like an okay.
Okay, great. And Michael?
There's just my last thought is, like, I think where my question was coming from is just finding if there's anywhere we could, get to the point where we have enough consensus on something to then have a place you could land code changes that people could look at and so forth. So the last thing I'll add in there is I know it's been discussed before, but I wonder again if, like we did for some of the other bigger efforts, incubating that in a fork of the repo makes any sense.
Well, Michael, maybe what we could do is incubate that kernel in the fork.
Right.
People can build on top of that. It doesn't have to land upstream.
Exactly. Like there didn't seem to be enough consensus to actually do it in the core repo. So if maybe, like we did for NAPI, have a fork, you can at least have a place where people can experiment. And, once it's it's gotten far enough and there's consensus, you can look at bringing it back into the core.
So I would like to make a suggestion to close out this issue. Are there any objections to making a fork of the repo and building out the kernel in there and and for ongoing discussion using that as the base? Okay, great.
I can't seem to find where the hell it is to raise my hand, so forgive me.
If you go to participants, I think, then you've got it's on that page.
Okay. Well, sorry. If I don't mean to butt into anyone else if I am. I'm fine with what you said, Miles. I would only say that, like, if we're going to leave experimental modules in Node, like even flagged, then I still want to move forward with improving it, because I could, if it's going to be out there in the public and people are going to use it even though we're telling them not to, then I want to try to keep molding it in the direction that, like, I would want to try to improve it to. Mm-hmm. If it's going to be pulled out, then it doesn't matter. But You know?
So as it is right now, like the agreement that we have as a working group is that Semver patch things can land on core. It's only Semver minors that need to have working group approval. And it wasn't, I mean, with the way that it works, it could land, just we're respecting the agreement, and the TSC said they would respect it. There's no code freeze on modules. Patches can land, like small fixes can land. The only thing that requires discussion is Semver minor changes. And, when things come in that are controversial, people may -1 it. But I think that you should, don't feel discouraged from opening pull requests against core. You just may want to, bring it to the working group first if you think it's going to be controversial.
Yeah, what I had in mind was just the one that we're already talking about in 160.
Okay. So with that being said, Wes, I see your thing, just so everyone hears it, about like potential deprecation warnings on experimental modules. I think maybe we should open an issue about that, have some discussion in the tracker, and bring it to the next meeting. The next thing that we have up here is feature adjustments and groupings. This is issue number 156. This is opened by Guy. I don't think, is Guy on the call today? Don't think so. This was added to the agenda by Guy. And I think this was about merging a handful of features together. Does anyone have more context on this issue?
I think it was just around fine-tuning some of the things that we had.
So I see here that it's a pull request. It was merging a handful of them together and reorganizing stuff. We have 3 approvals. It looks like there was an objection or a request for a change by Jeff. Are you happy with where it's at now?
Yeah, it was resolved.
Okay, so we definitely have enough people in the room now for consensus. Do we have consensus to land this? Okay, great. So I had misunderstood what this one was. I'm rebasing, I'm merging. That's good to go. And we just scored ourselves 10 minutes. So now we can talk about interop for a while. And if we have some time, we can head back to the discussion around a kernel, but I think we have consensus on that as well. So I'm going to go ahead and start a 10-minute timer. Who wants to lead the conversation on interop?
I can try to.
Okay, cool. Brad, 10 minutes. Let's start it.
Okay, so we have these vague terms for transparent interop, not transparent interop. I think there is, at least in the issue threads, a growing usage of import interop and require interop. Basically, transparent interop is somewhat vague in which it applies to, and import interop is the ability to import non-ESM modules, and require interop is the ability to require ESM modules. So when we're talking about interop, I'm going to try to lead people to use either require interop, import interop, or that's it. Let's not use a both. Let's just be a little bit explicit here. I know some people earlier in this discussion were saying interop is mandatory for a minimal implementation, not whatever the kernel is. Let's talk about implementation requirements. So if you think interop is required, can you just kind of go over your reasons and which kind, so we can get a little bit clearer picture if you're talking about both require interop and import interop, just import interop, or what? So yeah. Well, I think first hand I saw was Wes.
Then I can't raise my hand, so I had raised my hand in comment. I can go after Jeremiah.
Okay.
Right. So if we want to talk about strong feelings for interop,
All right. I have a lot of expectations for interop that I am well aware many of them probably won't come to fruition, but I'm going to state them anyway because it would be very nice if they can. Interop. So the first one that's important to me is actually being able to require or import things, specifically importing things in ESM, and you can import like a package name, like Lodash or whatever, and whether that package is ESM or CJS, there is a reasonable likelihood that you can get the same API out of it, not irregardless of what's actually under the hood. That's the first thing. And then the second thing that is arguably less important, but still important for the ecosystem to be able to move forward, is in CJS, being able to have a require call and then saying that you have your require call that can import a package name, and you can have a reasonable chance of being able to get a similar API back, whether the underlying package is ESM or CJS. Yes, I am aware that is less likely, but I'm going to state that anyway. Like, those two things are very important for people to actually be able to update their packages. Like, they're critical in that regard. Moving forward without them, I do think will hamstring how fast the ecosystem can move. That's just my stance.
Okay, can you clarify something? Because you're speaking in reasonably similar APIs. Does that mean the APIs need to exist according to some specific transformation as they do today? Or could that require a breaking change such that in the future they get the same APIs?
I mean that there needs to be a way that they can have the same API between some versions where there's an overlap where you can expose the same thing in ESM and CJS. Doesn't necessarily have to be pretty. It'd be nicer, the larger that overlap is, the better, because then the less effort module maintainers have to go through to work through this transition for their package consumers. But you need to be able to say, all right, Express now default, Express's CommonJS module now exports a member named default. Now it's always a default no matter how you import it. Great, cool, people can migrate. And then Express migrates the underlying code to ESM, and everybody's like, it's the same for all consumers. We didn't need to break our API to migrate to ESM. Ooh, we were able to do those two actions, breaking the API and migrating to ESM independently. Being able to do those two steps independently is very important.
Cool. Is that it?
Yes.
Nice. Good. I think up next was Jeremiah.
Yeah. So certainly I think that some level of interoperability and being able to load CJS from ESM and the opposite is required in any implementation. The part that I really care about above that is being able to statically import CommonJS so that load order can be correct in an ESM way, or at least correct in the ESM tree, where you would be able to have CommonJS code essentially run where you want it to run rather than run where ESM is going to tell it to run from where you're requiring it from. That is very important to me. I don't really care about requiring ESM or loading ESM from require specifically. I actually think that's a pretty bad idea. I do definitely expect import, the import function, to be available in CommonJS, which I think it already is. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, it's required in all grammars, so it's available everywhere.
Okay, so that kind of solves the ESM loading problem there. As for being able to load require or not, I am attempting to dig up the TSC or CTC meeting minutes from like 2 years ago, where I went and got opinions from a bunch of people who teach JavaScript on what things would be confusing in this loading stuff. And that was a very major point that they brought up, that require returning you a promise when no promise is exported explicitly from a module would be a very bad idea. And so I feel quite strongly about that too. I will attempt to dig that up, but it's proving a little bit challenging.
Cool. Okay,
Hi.
next was Miles.
Yeah. Hello. So I am very much with Jeremiah. I'll start over from the CommonJS side. Like from both sides, I think it is extremely important that we have a way to get ESM modules into CommonJS. And on the flip side, we need a way to get CommonJS modules into ESM. So interop to me is, I don't think there's any discussion around that. Now, we will be, as Brad was saying, we will get dynamic import everywhere. And import ESM is more or less exactly the API that require ESM would be if we did it, except it's explicit. And, the pattern you'll see in my preferences are generally things being explicit. It doesn't really solve all use cases. Unfortunately, it returns a promise, which means there's no real way to export those symbols, and those promises become infectious. But unfortunately, that's just what we have, unless we were to have top level await inside of CommonJS, which I really don't see how we could do without breaking the world. The flip side, coming over to the ESM side, I'm personally not a fan of allowing importing of CommonJS as long as it's done as a default and it hijacks the .js. I think that the ecosystem fracture that it creates, and I know that when we start digging in around MIME types, it's not from an underlying architecture perspective this way, but for the average person who's writing code, the way that they'll see it transparently is I'm able to import a file that's .js, and it's going to work in the browser when it's ESM. I will never be able to import Common. Common is not a goal that will be supported in that ecosystem, and making code work around both is important. Now, when we talk about a minimal kernel, I think one of the things that we can do early on that we can reach consensus around is supporting MJS. And I think having MJS, supporting MJS, having consensus around MJS for being like the pointer to the MIME type for ESM is an important thing for us to say, especially to the IETF when we want to have this standardized and accepted. I believe that APIs such as import meta require, although I know we don't have consensus around that, are the better ways of having explicit ways of bringing in CommonJS. One of the things that I think is really important here is that we can have extremely clear errors. If the main reason to talk about not of having transparent interoperability, specifically being able to import CommonJS, is having the ability for people to not have to know what's going on. But if we're able to trap errors, if we're able to trap trying to import CommonJS and give someone a clear error that says, hey, the package you're trying to import is a CommonJS error, please use this other API. I think that we have the ability to accomplish the goal from a user experience standpoint while not conflating the ecosystem and overloading the loader itself. I'll step back for now because there's lots of hands, and I think we only really should do another 5 minutes on this for right now.
Can I just get clarification? So you were saying that you want any minimal implementation to not use .js for CommonJS at least.
I think our minimal kernel should not support JS in import because it's too overloaded right now and we don't have consensus around it.
Okay. All right. Up next, I think, was Gil.
Yes, sorry. I'm mostly with Miles. I'll try to point it out from my point of view. First of all, requiring ESM, that for me, that's not possible. ESM is asynchronous, requires synchronous, and returning a promise from require is you just use await import and you're done. Dynamic import. So require ESM is a no-go for me. The other way, ESM to CJS, I think is very important because we have a lot of wild code out there that is using ESM in a transpiled sort of way. And there's this assumption that you can use ESM to import CJS modules. Now, Node has tried it, and the current implementation enables us to do that, import CJS from ESM, but it only and correctly allows default imports to be imported from CJS, which for me is not transparent. I can't take all the code out there that uses ES modules using transpilation and just port it as it is, because there's no named imports to use. So for me, the current transparent interop where you can import a CJS module isn't really transparent, and I would go with Miles in saying if we can't have import of JS, then let's not do it at all. Just use something like import.meta.require. So my point.
I know I'm jumping the queue, but last week was TC39, and I think it was Guy's proposal to create a new kind of module record. And although there was quibbling about that specific detail, the committee very specifically and enthusiastically said that TC39 will make whatever language changes they can get away with in order to enable Node to allow importing of named imports from CJS. So I don't think I think that is now something that we will be able to get.
How would they do named imports without executing the module?
They would be all in TDZ basically until.
Can we table this a little bit?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment, jump the queue and comment that is an open door we can talk about later.
So Gil, can we summarize this as if you are unable to do interop in a way that gets you named imports from non-ESM, it is not something we should include in a minimal implementation. Is that what you're saying?
Or an implementation at all, but definitely not the minimal implementation. Yes, that's a good summary.
Okay. Whew. I think up next was actually Saleh. Saleh?
Yeah. So terminology. So first thing I'm going to say that we want to agree on a distinction between referring to built-ins as CJS or not, because the built-in modules, I don't consider them CJS. In experimental modules, you can definitely import by name. I try to avoid it in longer-term experiments, but it's stable from my tests. But for CJS modules, I think static import versus dynamic import is something that we have to really be more clear about when we're saying import, because every time the word import is stated, if it's dynamic import, it's a completely different story. For CJS, static import, having a file, do all your require and CJS work, and then just import that one default import, can definitely be a very predictable way for you to say that I'm jumping out into the CJS ecosystem, I'm getting stuff done there, coming back into ESM, and this is all done before my static imports are linked and my module kicks in. Requiring ESM, definitely, whether or not it gives a promise or not, I don't think it's a good idea. If people really want to move forward, then we could encourage dynamic import statements in CJS modules as a very, very clear indication that the code is being updated. It's catching up with newer trends. It's not to be confused with code that might have not been updated and is requiring something, but that thing completely changed. I guess terminology, I'll just leave it there.
Can I get some clarification then?
Yeah.
You want us to treat static and dynamic import as separate mechanisms?
No, I think for dynamic import statements in a like in a CJS module, should be encouraged, as opposed to considering the implications of loading CJS as a static import of one of the ESM modules being loaded in a tree, like in a graph. So I'm just saying that when we're discussing things, we talk about import and CJS, just to always clarify if we're talking about a static or a dynamic import. I don't know if I made it any more clear or more confusing, but I can try to articulate this maybe if there's a discussion thread. I'll try to find a spot for this. If not, I'm going to open something, an issue or something.
Sounds good. We're running short on time, so let's just be a little quick. Wes was up next.
What were we talking about before we just swapped for the went on a tangent about static versus dynamic? Oh gosh, it's been so long.
Seamless imports between require and common.js, MIME types. Then what do we want? Well, there was something about named imports and how we would actually achieve that sort of thing.
Oh yeah. If the TC39 has said that they're going to edit the spec to allow named imports, I don't see why we wouldn't use them, because it allows the runtime to align with what transpilers have been doing for the past 3 years.
I also had a hand earlier when we can't have two hands in the meeting. One of the things that I was curious about was just like the idea of, we mentioned that there's like this risk of community fracture, and I was curious as to like what we specifically meant by that. Like there's like another community fracture, which is how people already consume ES modules and whatnot. But I understand there's another concern. I forget who specifically brought it up, but it was something about being able to load CommonJS in the browsers versus in Node. I mean, can someone elaborate on that?
Actually, like personally, not to get too technical, is there like a metric we can track as we roll this out to like know whether or not we are successful in avoiding whatever this fracture is?
Can I suggest that we make that an issue and follow up offline? I legitimately have a hard cut at 4, and that will end up ending the meeting.
Okay, sure, no worries.
Okay, Jeremiah, you got 2 minutes.
Yeah. So back on sort of what I was reinforcing earlier, like in response to Miles, I mean, I personally don't really have very strong feelings about, well, maybe that's the wrong way to say it. I want to say that I don't want to say that I don't care, but I kind of don't about aligning perfectly with browsers, because Node doesn't anyways. And also I care a lot more about things actually working well for Node and how our ecosystem is. So in that context, being able to statically import CommonJS is very important.
Okay, thank you, Jeremiah. And just one clarity there, I don't think that we shouldn't have a way to do it. I think the question is what the defaults are.
Can I get you two, I know you got 30 seconds, sometime after this, Miles, can you talk about the workaround with a wrapper module with Jeremiah?
Yeah, I definitely can, because I think that that's an interesting approach.
Okay.
Okay, cool.
Anybody else? Okay, that's it for Interrupt, I guess.
Killing this live stream. Thanks for joining us.